Hi, everybody. It's Mrs. Zerbst. I sincerely apologize for not being here, but I just wanted you to know that class shall go on as usual. Thank you to your sub for helping me out with this. I'm doing a screencast, which means I can do our whole lecture as if I was there, except without the questions, because that makes it kind of challenging. So, whatever we miss out on that's really important, I'll make up when I get back to school. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. You should have your notes out. You don't need an iPad just yet. This is going to be a strict lecture kind of a thing. If you are in my first period class, I'd like you to help I'm sorry, not Miss Hainline, whoever your sub is. I'm so sorry, I forgot your name. Go ahead and help your sub get to the point in this where we ended up. For all the other classes, we haven't even started this one yet, so you're going to start right now from the beginning. All right, so let's, without further ado, get started on chapter 29. All right, here we are. So we're talking about revolutions and national states in the Atlantic world. And first, before we can begin too much, we need to really talk about what's the difference between conservatism and liberalism. Conservatism assumes that society is an organism that changes slowly. So, a conservative, in the truest sense of the word, is someone who's going to be generally opposed to any changes, particularly radical changes. The philosophe, and philosophe is an individual who is a philosopher, who first perpetrated the idea of conservatism, is Edmund Burke. He came up with something called the generational contract theory. Kind of the Cliff Notes version of generational contract is that someone in my generation owes it to someone in your generation to provide them with a stable society. I don't owe you a lot, but one thing, according to Edmund Burke, that I do owe you is stability. And he saw the best way of creating that stability for there to be very little change. So he condemned radical change or revolution as part of his generational contract theory. Any kind of revolution causes instability and therefore is by definition bad. And the way to ensure that revolution doesn't occur, according to Burke, is to create a strong centralized government, i.e., a monarchy or a dictatorship. But in his case, because he's working in England as he's writing, he's of course going to be saying, yeah, monarchy is a great idea. And so that is, in a nutshell, what traditional conservatism is all about. Now, is that different in today's society? Absolutely. And we will be looking when we get to the 1980s about some new forms of conservatism and some new ideas that are put forward by Ronald Reagan, the great philosopher Ronald Reagan. All right, so now we're going to get to liberalism. A liberal, in general, believes that society is dynamic and that change is just a normal signaling process that happens when we are progressing forward as a society should. So a liberal is going to not just embrace change, but is actually going to make a concerted effort to make sure that society does change. So they're going to be trying to make sure that things are changing and moving forward. The first major liberal philosopher is John Stuart Mill, and his writings center around this idea that it's really inappropriate for a majority to impose its will on a minority. He believes that just because you have might does not mean that you have the right to change things. So he's going to propose that because change is a really normal process, that it should be channeled and managed rather than opposed or stopped. And he sees the best way to do this as a republican or constitutional form of government. So John Stuart Mill is going to be a proponent of, let me think. Well, we've got governments all over the world. We've got the United States government, obviously. But even more than that, a constitutional monarchy would be his preferred form of government over an absolute monarchy. Anytime when people have a voice, he's going to see that as a positive. All right, so what I need you to do now is pull out that Enlightenment Thinker sheet that we've been working on. It has Enlightenment Thinker, Big Idea, and Impact, and then down the left-hand side, you've got all the different philosophes. So you've got Adam Smith and Voltaire and John Locke, all of them. If you do not have yours, your sub has a couple of extra copies in the Unit 6, Chapter 29 folder on my desk, but really only a couple. If we run out of copies, go ahead and just write this information down in your notes. So, sub, if you will please pause this while everybody gets out their sheets, and then we'll start back up again as soon as everybody's ready to go. Okay. So now we're starting back up with Enlightenment thinkers. Really cool thing about Enlightenment thinkers, they applied new ways of understanding the natural world to human relationships. They're going to be all about the use of observation and inference, reason, scientific inquiry. They're going to really focus in on making sure that if we're saying something, that we have evidence to back that we have supports for what we're saying. So in the Enlightenment age, we're going to see a tremendous amount of arguing about stuff. And these guys are really cool with arguing. They think that that's a really natural process that kind of encourages change to happen in a really positive way, which by definition is going to make most of these Enlightenment thinkers liberal. They're also going to be critiquing the role that religion plays in public life, and they're going to insist on the importance of reason as opposed to revelation. Now, when we're talking about revelation, we're mainly talking about, biblical text. So this also, an Enlightenment thinker would be just as opposed to a Quranic text, or the Quran, as they would be to the Bible in making major decisions about how things should happen. They're going to say, reason, scientific inquiry, debate, these are the things that should really be steering the ship of how we live life, rather than the ship, I can't even talk on the video, the ship being steered by the Bible, revelation, belief systems. They're also going to develop new political ideas about the individual, natural rights, and the social contract. We'll get to that in the next few slides. And they're going to resist the existing political authorities, not just because they are the existing political authorities, but because those political authorities tend to have totalitarian aspects. They tend to be absolute monarchs, and because most of these guys are going to be liberal thinkers, they think change is a positive. They're looking for change. So we're going to see that in the next few slides. All right, so our first Enlightenment thinker is Thomas Hobbes. He is living and working in Great Britain between 1588 and 1679, and he would be a name I would expect to see in your timeline. His ideas are that in nature, people are cruel, greedy, and selfish, that they're going to fight, rob, and oppress one another just on basic principle. And where is he getting these ideas from? Probably from the Bible. If we look at his portrait, we can tell pretty quickly what his belief system is. Anybody see it? He's Puritan, okay? So he's not only going to be a Protestant, but he's going to be part of that Puritan sect that is really strict Protestant. And, that's your belief system informs what you say and what you do. So that's kind of an important key here. He believes that to escape this naturally selfish, greedy, awful person that we are, people would be willing to give up their freedom in order to get a safe, well-organized, well-maintained society. And we actually see this in action with a Puritan regime that is Thomas Cromwell. Okay, so Cromwell is the epitome of what Thomas Hobbes is talking about. Cromwell said you can't drink, you can't dance, you have to go to church every Sunday, you can't hang out with loose women or be friends with people who do, right? So Thomas Hobbes is really a product of his belief system. And he also believes that a powerful government like an absolute monarchy is really best for society because it's going to impose that kind of really strict order and compel the kind of obedience that's necessary to suppress those natural kind of evil desires. My favorite quote from Thomas Hobbes is this one: "Curiosity is the lust of the mind." I mean, really? Like, aren't scientists supposed to be curious? Isn't an artist supposed to be kind of curious? But he really kind of tells us who he is in this quote. So, what do you think? Is he conservative or liberal? He's conservative for sure. And he's really going to be the only one of our Enlightenment thinkers who is, which is interesting. All right, our next one is John Locke. He is overlapping with Thomas Hobbes. He's one of our older philosophers. He's working in England at the same place as Thomas Hobbes from 1632 to 1704. And much of what he says is really kind of a rebuttal of Thomas Hobbes. He believes in natural laws and natural rights. And he believes that people aren't bad when they're born, but instead, when they're born as a tabula rasa, which means a blank tablet. So he's going to believe that everything we know comes from the experience of our senses, what we smell and taste and hear and talk about. And, whatever happens in our life, that makes us who we are. If we are born into a family of robbers and thieves, then that's what we're going to become. But if we're born into a family and where we go to good schools and we think a lot, then we're probably going to become people who think a lot. So the things that he believes that aren't part of this tabula rasa are these natural rights that he believes are inherent in us and given to us from our Creator. So John Locke is also going to be a Christian and a Protestant, but he is not a Puritan. He believes that we're born with the right to life, liberty, and property. So in other words, we are allowed to breathe, we're allowed to be free, and we're allowed to own property. Now, those two things come into play really heavily after Locke's death with the question of abolition of slavery. Because if we're all able to have liberty and we're able to have property, then that begs the question, well, if slaves are property, are slaves supposed to be free? Okay? And so John Locke never really deals with this question. He simply puts his ideas out there, and then other people are going to be fighting about these questions in the future. He wrote a really famous book called Two Treatises on Government, and his quote is, "All mankind being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." So is he conservative or liberal? If you guessed liberal, I agree. He also says some other things. He says that rulers and governments have an obligation and a responsibility to protect those natural rights of the people that they govern. What are those three natural rights? Life, liberty, property. He says if a government fails in its obligation to protect those natural rights, that the people have the right to overthrow that government. The best government is one which is accepted by all of the people, but which has limited power. He really thought the English monarchy was a pretty good system where the king, he was a king, but he didn't have all the power. And Locke's influence is going to be really heavily evident in the Declaration of Independence. But Thomas Jefferson's going to change it up a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. He doesn't say life, liberty, property. Locke justified revolution in the eyes of the Founding Fathers. He was widely read by Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, all of the Founding Fathers of the United States read and most owned copies of his work. And he also influenced pretty heavily later in revolutions in France, the ones in South America. Simón Bolívar is going to be a proponent of Locke's work. So he's extremely important when we begin to talk about philosophers. Our next philosopher is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. His concept, first, where's he working and living? He's actually a Frenchman who got kicked out of France by Louis XVI and ends up spending the rest of his life working in Switzerland, which was a little bit freer with the freedom of speech thing. His time period is 1712 to 1778, and his concept is that people are basically pretty good, but they become corrupted by society. And his big evidence for this is the French monarchy. You know, monarchy's not so bad. French monarchy, living at Versailles, kind of ridiculous. So for Rousseau, the social contract was the path to freedom. He said people should do what is best for their community. Rousseau's version of the social contract is that the general will of the people is to do good for one another. And so the good of the community is going to be much more important than the good of the individual. So if it means that, the guy who steals stuff has to be killed, well, then he has to be killed. So we're going to look to the good of the community rather than the interest of that individual who stole something. Rousseau's work, his idea on social contract, is going to be used a lot during the terror of the French Revolution. It's going to be used as an excuse to go ahead and guillotine people because we're doing this for the good of all, not just the good of one. So is he conservative or liberal? He's going to be a liberal. And the way we can tell this is because he is looking for change. He's looking for the French monarchy to be destroyed. Force does not constitute right. Obedience is due only to legitimate powers. This quote was in direct reference to Louis XVI. All right, this guy you've probably heard about quite a bit. I know you heard about him in 7th grade and then again in 8th grade. Montesquieu is living and working in France from 1689 to 1755. And he was probably the strongest voice critiquing monarchy, particularly absolute monarchies. And he didn't just go after the French monarchy, he went after all of them. He was the voice for democracy. What he did is he actually went through all of the history of the known world up to this point. He was a world historian, kind of like you guys. And he looked at all the different governments and cultures that had existed and tried to figure out what was the best way to do a government so that you had success. What was going to last the longest? What was going to be the most effective for the people that lived under it? And he decided that the best way to protect people's liberty was to divide the powers of government into 3 branches. He said you got to have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. And he wrote this down in his book called The Spirit of the Laws. Also in The Spirit of the Laws, he said, not only do you need 3 branches of government, but every branch of government really needs to kind of check and balance the other 2 branches so that the power doesn't become concentrated in one area instead of the other. We don't want a really strong judicial and a really weak executive and legislative. We need to have at least 2 strong branches that can check each other at an absolute minimum. His quote, "The spirit of moderation should also be the spirit of the lawgiver." So again, we see in this quote the checks and balances concept. And Montesquieu is going to be conservative or liberal. Yeah, he's definitely a liberal. He is trying to change monarchies and turn them into democracies. All right, Voltaire. Voltaire lives the longest, I think, of all of our Enlightenment philosophers. He is living from 1694 to 1778. So he actually lives to see his work being used in the Declaration of Independence, which is kind of cool. Voltaire advocates for freedom of thought, speech, politics, and religion. He essentially says people should just be free to say and think what they want and do what they want. He is really famous for fighting against intolerance, injustice, inequity, ignorance, and superstition. So he's going to be one of our philosophers who's really anti-Catholic Church. He feels like if you are following the ideas of revelation instead of reason, that you're just kind of being backwards. He also went after the the first and second estate pretty heavily on being idle and lazy. He goes after corrupt government officials. He goes after prejudice based on religion. And he is one of the only philosophers who directly attacks the slave trade. He often had to use fiction as a device for his writing because his ideas were so incredibly controversial. And he writes Candide as a fiction because he's got to be able to maintain his head as he lives through absolute monarchy in France. Voltaire was the pen pal of Catherine the Great of Russia, and they got into a really big tiff because he told her, look, serfs are slaves, okay? So you really need to let the serfs go free, and you have the power to do so, Catherine. So if you really want to be an Enlightenment thinker and you really want to be an enlightened ruler, girl, put your money where your mouth is and get it done. And she realized that if she let all the serfs go free, not only would her people, revolt, she also would have big famines on her hands and a lot of political problems that she didn't need because she was a woman ruler. And so she and he had a big falling out. But she really respected his ideas. And we know this because at the end of his life, he kind of ran out of money. Like, people started to not buy his books and whatnot. So he runs out of money, and so she actually buys his entire library for this exorbitant amount of money, and it allows him to live out the rest of his life in relative comfort and ease. So it was kind of a happy ending, I guess. I love his quote. It's my favorite of all of the quotes that we'll be looking at today. He says, "I do not agree with a word you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." This is freedom of speech at its very core. All right, our next one is Denis Diderot. How did I do, Juliet? Did I use that right? Okay. He lives from 1713 to 1784. This particular philosopher worked for 25 years on one book. It's the Encyclopedia. It actually is 28 volumes of one book. But this is going to be the first one that is published in Europe. It is not, however, the first one published in history. Does anybody remember the first one? The first one was actually the Yongle Encyclopedia, because as we know, all good things begin in China. Very good. All right, the encyclopedia was not just a collection of articles on human knowledge. It was actually intended to change the way that people thought about knowledge. Prior to the Enlightenment, where do people get their knowledge? From the church, right? Because all education happens with the church. And Diderot is going to say, wait a minute, education doesn't have to happen with the church. You can actually educate yourself. And so here's a book. You just have to read it and you will know stuff. You don't have to listen to your priest to find out stuff. The Catholic Church was so upset about this that they literally put the threat of excommunication, which means go to hell free card, on anyone who bought this book. They really wanted to hang on to this ability to have education be their domain. And so this is going to be a tremendous problem. But despite this threat of excommunication, 20,000 copies of this 28-volume set of encyclopedias were printed during 1751 to 1798. Or I'm sorry, 1789. So basically during his lifetime, Diderot was able to see, hey, wait a minute, I'm not the only one who thinks that a secular education is an important thing. So does everybody else. And the encyclopedia it wasn't an encyclopedia in the sense of what we think of an encyclopedia, where you see a picture of a butterfly and it tells you this is in this genus and this phenome and stuff. The encyclopedia actually kind of gave you, hey, here's how societies work, and here's what an absolute monarchy is. And so it had economics in there, and it had information about trading systems, and, what's the price of salt, and why is that important to you? So it was really a really comprehensive book. His quote is, "Every man has his dignity. I'm willing to forget mine, but at my own discretion and not when someone else tells me to. And so he's really big on self-sufficiency. Diderot is a huge philosopher for, hey, you want to know something? Figure it out. Learn yourself, kind of like you guys do in this class. All right. Our one and only woman that makes our cut of really important philosophes is Mary Wollstonecraft. She is living and working between 1759 and 1797 in England. And her big argument is, dude, all you men are sitting around talking about enlightenment and freedom and equality, but women have been completely excluded from your social contracts. And so she writes this book called Vindication of the Rights of Women, where she says, not cool, guys. Women are just as eligible for these freedoms and these rights as you guys are wanting to get for men. Her arguments were often met with scorn, and sadly enough, even from some of the most enlightened men that lived during her lifetime. If you look back in your notes, you'll see a who's who of philosophers. Not one of them failed to make fun of or to deride Mary Wollstonecraft in writing. And you can look it up. You can find where they really kind of mocked her and made light of her life's work. But she really didn't let it stop her. She believed in equal education for girls and boys, and she genuinely believed that only education could give women the knowledge to fully participate in public life with men. So she starts up schools all around England that give equal educations to women. And ladies, if you are sitting in this room in an AP class today, you would not be here without this woman. Mary Wollstonecraft is one of our heroes. And gentlemen, I would say that the same thing is true for you as well. Because if your mom hadn't thought that education was important, it's very unlikely that you would be sitting here either. So, everybody give Mary a big round of applause. She is awesome. Yay, Mary. Okay, moving on. Some of her quotes are right here. Let me pick out my favorite one. Oh, this is the one. I like the third one, and I also really like the fourth one. But let me read the third one to you. Let not men then in the pride of power use the same arguments that tyrannic kings and venal ministers have used, and fallaciously assert that women ought to be subjected because she has always been so. Love that one. All right, next one is Adam Smith. You all know already that I heart Adam Smith. He lives between 1723 and 1790. He was actually Scottish, and he's been called the father of capitalism. He writes his book, Wealth of Nations, that explains how capitalist principles work better than mercantilist principles. That if you let people make a better mousetrap, then they will sell more mousetraps, and then there will be less mice and everybody benefits. But if there is no impetus to make a better mousetrap, then life doesn't get better for anybody. He was a big advocate of something known as laissez-faire, which is French for the words let do, let go, let pass. It's also kind of a hands-off kind of an economic policy. And who is keeping their hands off? It's really the government that he wants to keep their hands off of the economy. He wants politicians to just let the markets run and do what markets do best. Laissez-faire is a theory of natural law of economics, that business should operate with very little or with no government interference. And it's interesting, it really we kind of ran with this in American history up until about the late 1800s in the Gilded Age, when we realized that if you just let business do what business wants to do, eventually they're going to become very corrupt. We're going to get monopolies, and people are going to end up with things like they do in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, where rat meat is going into your hamburger and being sold in stores, and people are dying. So laissez-faire sounds good in theory, but, doesn't always work great in practice. His quote is, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." So essentially what he's saying is, like, the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, they aren't creating bread and beer and meat for us just because they're nice people. They're doing so because they're going to get money for it. I mean, it's kind of makes sense. So is Adam Smith a conservative or a liberal? Definitely a liberal. All right, so it's time for us to transition away from our Enlightenment thinkers. And what I want us to do, I'm going to have in just a minute, my sub is going to be kind enough to pause this for me. You guys, on your Enlightenment thinker sheet, you have the big idea for each of these people, but then you also have the impact that they made. So what I want you to do on this sheet is I want you to take the next 15 minutes, and your sub is going to time you. You're actually going to come up with as many impacts of these ideas as you can. And I don't want these to be like paragraph length. We have a really small sheet here. But I want you to come up with impacts that are long-term, long-reaching, into the present day. So starting with Adam Smith, he's our first one. His big idea is obviously capitalism. And the impact of capitalism is Coca-Cola. Sorry about this.
Edward, I'm calling you. Please answer the phone. I'll try again.
Sorry, I'm recording this after school. The impact of capitalism is Coca-Cola. It is the Apple iPhone that is in your pocket. It is wars. We've had lots of wars over capitalism. Vietnam would be one of them. Another impact of capitalism is innovation. I mean, if we hadn't had capitalism, the Wright brothers wouldn't have created the airplane that we now get to take to go to Disney World, where we get to spend tons of money on capitalist things like mouse ears. Okay? So you can think about this in a minutia, or you can think about this in a macro kind of way, but I really want you to talk this over in groups of no more than 4. And I want you to come up with as many of these impacts as you can. And when I get back, we'll talk about this some more. But I want you to go ahead and do that now. So, sub, if you would kindly pause this and start the timer for about 15 minutes. And we'll come back in a minute. Okay, so we're back, and it is now time to begin talking about our revolutionary documents. So our philosophes, they talk about all these great things, and they have all these great ideas, but they're not really the ones that are going to implement these ideas. The implementers of these are the people who are actually going to be on the ground creating revolution. But our implementers of revolution don't do so in a vacuum. They do so with the backing and consent of documents that explain why they are doing what they do. So as these writings and ideas and thoughts and musings of our Enlightenment thinkers are kind of marinating worldwide, some key documents begin to emerge that support the revolution, using the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers in very concrete, constructive, or destructive ways. So the first one we're going to look at is the American Declaration of Independence. So what I want you to do is grab those devices, and we're actually going to take a look at the Declaration of Independence and read it, okay? So go ahead and do a little Google search, find a copy of it that you can actually read, and we're going to have our sub pause while you read that. Okay, so you've read it. The interesting thing about the Declaration of Independence is that we hear a lot of Enlightenment thinkers in it, but who's the largest voice? It's John Locke, right? Because Thomas Jefferson, the actual originator of, or I should say, he's on a team, but he's the one who really writes it. He's calling for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now that's different from John Locke. What did John Locke ask for? There you go. I know Meg's got it. Life, liberty, and property. So why does Thomas Jefferson ask for the pursuit of happiness rather than for property? Well, really, it has to do with the fact that Jefferson knows how this government is going to be set up. He already has it in his mind that he's going to set this up as a republic, not a democracy. But who gets to vote in a republic? Well, in Jefferson's mind, the persons who should be doing the voting are the persons who own property. And he doesn't want just every old person in the Americas to be able to have a say in how this government gets run. He believes that the persons who should be having a vote are the people who have the property. So he doesn't want everyone to have property. He only wants men of means, men who are enlightened and educated to have the right to vote. But he does want everybody to have the pursuit of happiness. So he really kind of tweaks that language in a very purposeful way. But if we look at the Declaration of Independence, it essentially tells us why Jefferson and why the signers of the Declaration believe that we should be independent. Okay, so why should we be independent? It's because the English government isn't providing us with those abilities to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, the next one we're going to look at is the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. So, if you want to go ahead and pause this, we'll go ahead and read our Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen. About 15 minutes. Okay, so we're back. Anybody could read it? I'm going with no, because what language is that? Oh, it's French, which means a few of you could read a little bit of it, but none of us can read it entirely, probably. So let me give you the Cliff Notes version. The Declaration of the Rights of the Man and Citizen is calling for the equality of all men. What would Mary Wollstonecraft say about that? She would say, yeah, thanks a lot, right? No women in there. It also says that sovereignty rests not in the monarchy, but in the people. Good. And it calls for the individual rights of liberty, property, and security. Oh, this is different still. So this particular founding document is also using Locke, but again, we've tweaked it. And now, instead of asking for liberty, life, and property, we're asking for security. So this is where we see the work of Rousseau coming in, because we're not asking for the same things as Locke asked for. We're actually asking for a social contract here. And so the reason that that's important is because this is going to open the door for the Great Reign of Terror, because security means what's best for everyone, not what's best for the individual. Next is Bolivar's Jamaica letter. Now, this is an interesting mural that I have put up here. This is actually a mural that was in Venezuela, and it's a little bit hard to understand unless you've got the background. So, in the center, who do we have? Some of you can see this is supposed to be Jesus, although he looks really happy, and I'm not really sure what he's pointing at. On his left over here, this is Simón Bolívar. He is the fighter for Bolivian and Venezuelan independence. And then over here on the right, we have Hugo Chavez, who is, interestingly enough, the first communist leader in South America. Bolivar's Jamaica letter was written by this man on the left. It was written by Simón Bolívar, and he is one of my all-time favorites as far as revolutionaries. He's a really interesting character. But his letter essentially says, same thing as our Declaration of Independence, and it was written as a conversation between philosophical men between himself and one of his friends living in Jamaica at the time. And it essentially does the same thing as the Declaration of Independence and as the French Declaration, which basically it's just saying, hey, here's the reasons why we deserve to be free. And so he uses some of the very same language that we saw in the other two declarations. Okay, so this brings us to the American Revolution. This would be something you would absolutely need for your timeline, 1775 to 1783. Which philosopher most likely was behind the ideology of the American Revolution? John Locke. Absolutely, John Locke. Okay? So we've got assistance in the American Revolution by the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and by the German states. They all sent military help, they all sent financial help, they all sent advisors. Now, why? Not sure? All right. So let me talk us through this. Why would the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Germans all send help for the American Revolution? Well, each of these people group have some things in common. And what the big thing is in common is that they are either working on or have aspirations to work on becoming a world power. And they have some pretty significant problems with the monarchies that are either ruling or trying to rule those areas. So really, the stake that they all have is they all want to see if this experiment happening in what will become the United States can work. Because if the United States can throw off the yoke of Great Britain and become a successful republic, then each of these areas could potentially do the same thing. The French Revolution, 1787 to 1799. And actually, let me go back one more. The French Revolution has more in common with the South American revolutions than it is going to have in common with the American Revolution. And I realize that I didn't tell you the story of the American Revolution, but I'm going to assume that from 8th grade, you have kind of a handle on what that looks like. So we're going to skip right over that and go straight to France. All right, now I'm going to move forward. In France, up to the point of the French Revolution, we have 3 estates. Who was in each estate? You guys should already know this. First estate is the clergy. Second estate is the nobility. Third estate is everybody else, okay? So regardless of how wealthy you are, you could be in the third estate if you were a merchant or if you were something that's not nobility. Really important to understand. All right, so this brings us to King Louis XVI. He's going to be our major player, one of our major players during the French Revolution. Louis XVI was a weak and extravagant leader, okay? His wife, Marie Antoinette, was actually the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, and she's from Austria. These two got married when they were 16 years old. All right, so we know some things about young rulers, and I keep harping on this, but this is a continuity, people. Like, this is a gimme. So, young rulers always have to prove themselves, and King Louis XVI is absolutely no different. He and his wife are young and impetuous, and they have something to prove. So one of the things that he immediately does is they spend too much money on Versailles. Versailles is the palace that was built by his grandfather, Louis XIV. He just makes it bigger and better, all right? And we'll talk about that shortly. But he also spends a ton of money on wars that he has no business being in. So in the process of doing this, over about a 10-year period, Beaufort gets himself in some serious debt. He spends more money than France can make in taxes. He changes all the time. He's constantly changing who is in charge of the finances, which is never a good thing. So basically gets himself in a point where he needs more money. So he calls a meeting called the Estates General. The Estates General is a meeting that hasn't occurred in about 140 years before King Louis XVI. And it essentially is just where all the estates get to send in representatives. Now, King Louis XVI really thinks he's just going to call the Estates General, everybody's going to approve his taxes, voila, he's going to send him home. All right? But what happened differently this time that had not happened previously is that King Louis XVI is freaking weak, and everybody knows it. And everybody also knows what he wants, okay? So everybody comes to this meeting, which you can see in this picture here, and they've got an agenda, okay? So the king's agenda is he wants taxes. He needs more money. The First Estate's agenda is they want two things. They want to make sure that the Third Estate, which is like most of the people, it's like 98% of the people in France, don't get their way. They don't want them to have a vote. And they want to make sure that the clergy continue to not pay taxes. The Second Estate wants something too. They have an agenda too. They also want to keep the Third Estate from getting a vote. Because remember now, this is our nobility, and there's not too many of them, but they have pretty good social standing. And they also do not pay taxes and want to continue to not pay taxes. So the Second Estate also has the same agenda as the First Estate. So are these two groups going to get together? It's looking nefarious. The Third Estate came in with their own agenda, and their agenda was they wanted every single person of the Third Estate to get one vote. Now, the way the Estates General works is each estate gets one vote. So the First Estate gets to vote, Second Estate gets to vote, Third Estate gets one vote. All right? So, I mean, if you do some pretty simple math, if the First Estate gets one vote and the Second Estate gets one vote, they have the same agenda. So are they going to outvote the Third Estate? Every time. But if the Third Estate is looking at this system and saying, this is crap, man. We make up 98% of the population of this country, and we always are going to get outvoted in this system. The system is broken. All right? So remember, we're in the Age of Enlightenment. So people are talking, and people have ideas, and people think there are things like social contracts. So the Third Estate isn't going to just roll over and give the king his tax money and get just steamrolled again. So it comes to a head. The First and Second Estate decided that the Third Estate was being too ruly at this meeting. Let me go back. At this meeting right here, the one we're looking at in this picture. And so the First and Second Estate got together and they was like, hey, in the morning, we'll stop for lunch, early lunch. Everybody will leave the hall, but we'll let the Third Estate file out quickly first, and then we'll lock the doors. We'll go ahead and have the vote, and they won't be able to continue to argue with us. Well, the Third Estate people got locked out, and they were like, dude, this is just ridiculous. We are not going to stand for this. So they walk over to what is called the tennis court. It actually was a handball court, but, whatever. Tennis court, handball court, whatever. So at the tennis court, they refuse to leave. They say, we are going to stay here on the grounds of Versailles, and we are not leaving until we do two things. Number one, we will write a constitution. And number two, we will begin assembling as a national assembly. This is like key. This is like, I'm trying to think. For France, this would be like America's Emancipation Proclamation, right? When the slaves get freed by Abraham Lincoln. Like, this is a huge symbolic event. So it symbolizes the beginning of representative government, and it symbolizes an end to absolute monarchy. Because if the king is so weak that he's literally in his own palace, and this third estate is able to take over his tennis court and refuse to leave, and there's nothing he can do to stop them, that demonstrates, it's evidence that this king, Louis XVI, is about as weak as they come. All right, so this brings us to the storming of the Bastille. This thing just continues to escalate. Think of it as like a snowball rolling down the hill. So, all right, so we've got, go back. We've got the tennis court oath, which takes place, I forgot to put a date on it. Rats! Okay, we'll get a date for you later. So we've got the storming of the Bastille. This is after the tennis court oath. The third estate is kind of riled up, and they realize, hey, wait a minute, if we're able to have a constitution and a national assembly, then probably it's not okay for the biggest prison in the center of Paris to be full of people who are in there just for speaking their mind. It really was. Louis XVI had been imprisoning people for very little cause, just for disagreeing with him for years and years, in really horrible conditions. But the Bastille had a dual purpose. It wasn't just a prison, it was also the armory for the government in Paris. It was the local armory. So the peasants stormed the Bastille with the premise that they want to get their friends out. But really, since there's only 7 prisoners in the Bastille at the time when it was stormed, it's much more likely that that was a premise for getting guns. And so essentially, all of the Third Estate in Paris is armed with weapons thanks to the ineptitude of the monarchy because they didn't have enough guards on hand at the Bastille. This brings us to the year 1791. The National Assembly had been working for a few years. The king, he just continued to get weaker and weaker. It didn't really matter at this point what he's saying. People aren't really listening to him. The Third Estate in Paris is completely armed and dangerous. And so the king and his wife start to get pretty scared. And so this top picture up here is actually what the king does next. So the king and his wife and family get into a regular old carriage. It's not anything fancy. You can kind of see it. And they try to make a break for it and escape to Austria, where Marie Antoinette's family is from. He's stopped by it's just a regular old policeman who asks to see his documents, and he shows him his passport. But the problem with the passport is that Louis XVI signed it himself. So instantly, because that's not the signature that should be on there, the policeman realized that the people in the carriage are the royal family. And so he makes a split-second decision. He stops them, detains them, and the National Assembly actually brings them back to Paris, where they become imprisoned inside of a castle in Paris. So they're basically prisoners of the Third Estate in Paris. It's also during 1791 that the National Assembly gets a new name. They begin to call themselves the National Convention. This picture down here on the bottom is of a guy whose name used to be Sean Combs, and then he went through several incantations. He called himself P. Daddy, P. Diddy, Sean. I'm trying to think what else. Anyway, it didn't matter what he called himself. His name, he is Puff Daddy, okay? So the guy has the same name no matter what he calls himself. I put that picture there. It used to be way more relevant than it is now. But essentially, the National Convention is still the Third Estate wanting to have a voice. So they've been called the Third Estate. They've been called the National Assembly. Now these same people are called the National Convention. All right, so we're going to have a quick checking for understanding, because it's really important that you understand the difference between a liberal and a conservative philosophe. So If you would, please go get your whiteboards. Okay, go get your whiteboards. And we'll go ahead and pause this for a second while you get ready. All right, we're back. All right, does a conservative want change? Yes or no? All right, the answer is no. Will a conservative want to keep the monarchy? Go ahead and put your answer on your whiteboard. Show them to everybody. The answer is yes, a conservative will want to keep a monarchy. Does a liberal want change? Go ahead and put it on your whiteboard. And the answer is yes, a liberal always wants change. They think that that's a natural thing. Next one. Will the liberal want to keep the monarchy? Answer? No, absolutely not. A liberal believes that the best form of republic or a government is a republic or a constitutional monarchy. What is the prevailing thought of the day? Liberal or conservative? Liberal. The Enlightenment is all about liberal thought. There was only one of our Enlightenment thinkers who was a conservative. All right, guys, we are done for today. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me with this lesson. I know that this is really difficult, and I genuinely appreciate you kind of trooping it out with me. I hope that this has been a good learning experience for you. And I want to answer whatever questions you have. So I will be out of school periodically for the next few weeks, but I will always check my email and I will always answer your questions. So please email me with those questions and let's keep those communication lines open. I love you all. I miss you and I hope you have a great day. Bye.